Welcome to this presentation. Today we're going to discuss terminal punctuation. So let's get started. Let's go over here to our textbook. This is the online version that I have access to of the Aspen Handbook for Legal Writers. You may well have the 3rd edition, which has a green cover, or you might have the 4th edition, which has a red cover. I actually have the green cover myself, but we'll be using the red cover version for this particular session. So the page numbers might be a little bit off and the content might be a little bit different in your textbook versus the online version. Whichever version you have, though, I recommend that you go ahead and get that handy and refer to it as we read. You may want to take notes in the margin so that you'll have some reference points for our discussion as we go forward. This material will be relevant to the grammar proofreading assignment that you'll be doing in this module, and also it will be relevant to the Module 6 grammar assignments that you do. In addition, this material will be covered in both the midterm and the final examination. So there'll be lots of different times that you'll be calling upon this information. So don't, or be sure to take careful notes so that you won't have to watch this video several times, unless of course you find it really, really entertaining. Okay, so let's get started. Introduction you can pretty much skip over. Let's get started on end punctuation. End punctuation is oftentimes called terminal punctuation, and we have 3 of those in English. We have the period, we have the question mark, and we have the exclamation point, and we'll talk about all 3 of those in this lecture. But we're going to talk about the rock star of this group first, which is the period. It's what we use about 95% of the time when we're talking about any type of writing, really, and certainly legal writing. And this, of course, indicates we're done with a sentence. The sentence is complete, and we're telling the reader, okay, now it's time to pause. I took Latin when I was in school, and one of the interesting things I learned about Latin was that up until the Middle Ages, there was no punctuation in Latin. And so the only way that you could tell where a new sentence was by meaning. And also in Latin, word order isn't nearly as important as it is in English. Latin speakers, not that there are any, but back when there were Latin speakers, they would tell what the function of a particular noun was in a sentence by the suffix that was attached to it instead of by the word order. So it must have been really, really difficult when you were reading something to tell where a sentence ends and where a sentence begins. So I use that just as a point of departure to show, hey, it's really important. This is signaling really, really important information. It's relatively rare that students have trouble finding where to put the period. That's not a common problem. We will discuss the problem of sentence fragments, and that can be a problem, but people usually know when they have a sentence to put a period in it. So let's talk about a few kind of quirky stuff about periods. Sometimes you'll find that there is an abbreviation at the end of the sentence. In this example, we have the hearing is at 4 p.m. Well, the M has a period after it. Obviously, PM is abbreviation for post-meridian. And then we're also ending a sentence. So there's a temptation to put 2 periods, 1 period for the abbreviation, 1 period for the end of the sentence. However, we do not do that in legal writing or really any type of writing. So the better way of doing this is going to be, the correct way, not just the better way, but the only way of doing this is going to be to get rid of one of these periods. This is a proofreading mark, so the second period is going away. The 1 period can perform, quote unquote, many, many different functions. If the period is mid-sentence, though, and we have punctuation after it, we're going to retain the normal punctuation. So we keep the period for post or anti-meridian here, but then we follow with a comma, because a comma is a different function than a period. So we can have a period followed by a colon or a comma or a semicolon or a quotation mark or something like that. Let's see what other things we need to talk about. Let's talk about spacing between sentences. Now, this is kind of a controversial topic. I'm going to give a little bit of history because for those of y'all that are younger than me, which is about 99% of you, this may not be information that you have readily available. So you might be able to talk to your parents or perhaps your grandparents about this. And that is that once upon a time there were these lovely inventions called typewriters. And typewriters worked in many respects like word processors, but there were some important differences. And one of the differences was how the typewriter advanced from one letter to the other. So what would happen is that when I'm typing a document and I'm typing a skinny I, for example, well, the cartridge in the typewriter is going to advance the same distance as if I had typed a thick, big W or M. And obviously we know that an M or a W is going to be much wider, much fatter than a small I would be. But the typewriters were not programmed. I mean, there really wasn't any programming involved in these. They weren't sufficiently smart, so to speak, to know what was the letter I just typed and to let that information influence how far they advanced the cartridge over. So as a result, typewritten documents look different than computer-generated documents because the computers can now alter that spacing. So if you're typing a skinny I, the next letter is going to be only just a little bit to the right of that skinny I. If you had typed in a fat W, then the next letter is going to be significantly more to the right under those circumstances. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that we want to use the tab button instead of the space button, because nowadays each letter, because of its different thicknesses, the text is going to move at differing paces. So hitting the space bar won't allow your text to line up into a nice, crisp margin on the left. The tab button is the mechanism to do that. And we'll talk more about that in other videos. But in any event, so because of this automatic advancing, it became common to use this two spaces between the sentences. It was perceived of as easier to read. But because of the fact that we don't do that automatic space for each letter, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to continue that tradition when we have word process documents. So you will find some people who will space one space between sentences and some who will space two spaces between sentences. A pretty significant number of the people who do two spaces are people who learn to type on typewriters. So we are a dying breed. It's not wrong to do the two spaces, but I would say that now the preferred response is the one space. So you can do either, and I'm not going to count off for either one of those approaches. But if you haven't established a precedent for yourself in this area, I would encourage you to do the one space rule, just because it's the wave of the future. Let me show you how you set that up in Word, just so we can have a point of comparison. Here we go, open. Let's just do a new document. Okay. Let me just show you what I mean about the various spacing. So I'm going to do Times New Roman, which moves at various rates across. So if we type let me make even a bigger font here. Let's do a really obnoxiously big font. So I'm going to type, and you can see the W is super wide. That's how big that space is. But our I space is super small. Let me show you a different. We're going to do Courier. And you can see every letter is spaced exactly the same distance. It kind of looks weird because your I is literally as fat as your capital W. And this is what we call the monospacing thing. This is how typewriters used to be. In fact, Courier was a very popular font with typewriters. But obviously that's not popular anymore. And so we don't do that anymore. Let me show you how you can set up words so it will remind you about whatever rule you want to establish, whether you want the 2 space between sentences or the 1 space between sentences. If you have the same version of Word that I have, you go into File, you go into Options, you go into Proofing, and then you go into Settings, okay? And then space between sentences. I've set it up for 1 space. You can set it up for 2 spaces, or you can say don't check. Either way is fine. But if you want to move to the 1 space rule, then this is a good way of doing it. What Word will do once you've told it what the rule is that it will fuss at you if you don't follow the rule. So I'm going to switch to Times New Roman and just show you an example of that. Okay, my name is Cynthia Gruber. I am from Frisco. I was born in Freeport. Okay, now I have the paragraph sign here which shows all the formatting, so I'm going to make that go away. And you can see that when I just had 1 space, let me just turn this on, when I just have 1 dot, Word's happy with me. But here I have 2 dots, Word saying, now you told us you only wanted 1 dot between between sentences. And so now that I correct that, that little line goes away. So Word will help you develop a consistent habit in that area if you wish to have one. And I think it's a good, whichever way you want to go, 1 space or 2 space, you want to be consistent in how you do that. Okay, now let's talk about question marks. So at this point, you're probably thinking, yeah, I already know all this stuff. Why are you telling me this stuff, lady? Move on to another topic. This is perhaps going to be new information. But this is a common error that students have in this class. Some of it may be students who have grown up in a different country may have been used to a different rule. My understanding is in England there is a different practice with respect to quotation marks. Generally speaking, we put punctuation within the quotation marks. And so, actually this is about question marks, I'm sorry. So forget what I was talking about there. Let's first of all talk about question marks, we'll talk about quotation marks later. Ignore what I just said. Okay, so question marks. When do we use a question mark? Well, this is not hard. You know the answer to this. You use it when you're actually asking a question. But there are 2 types of questions. One is what we call the direct question. Who will be appointed as the arbitrator? So if I ask you that question, I'm expecting you to tell me Bob Smith or Theresa May or whatever the person's name is. An indirect question is different. It is not asking the person to whom you are speaking right then to answer the question. Here we have, I asked if all the exhibits had been attached to the brief. So you could rewrite this and you could say this. The initial sentence, let me just write the initial sentence. I ask if all of the exhibits were attached to the brief. Okay, let me go to another page here. Okay, so this is a sentence. If I wanted to change it into a question, I would say, are or were all of the exhibits attached to the brief? Okay, so this is, I'm asking the question right now directly to a person. I'm wanting to hear yes or no. When I say it this way, I'm summarizing something I did, maybe to somebody else. I'm not expecting the next word out of the listener's ears to be yes or mouth to be yes or no. You can see the difference between these questions. Occasionally people will think that this requires a question mark. Sometimes even Word will think it requires a question mark depending upon how you've actually phrased it. Okay, so whenever you're dealing with Word and Word suggestions, they can be tremendously useful. I highly recommend that you use them, but use them with a critical eye. They are not always correct. Let's talk about exclamation points. This is super, super easy. Just don't use them in legal writing. The only time that you should use an exclamation point in legal writing is when you are preserving a quotation and the original quotation had an exclamation point. At all other times, you ought to use a period instead of an exclamation point. In this course, if you ever use an exclamation point, it is extremely likely you will lose a point. I will tell you that in emails within a legal office, the use of an exclamation point between colleagues isn't a big deal. So I don't want to get too, oh my gosh, you can never use an exclamation point. But for this class, you can't. And a best practice is don't use the exclamation point. It's too informal. It's too conversational, so don't use it. So this concludes this presentation about terminal punctuation. We'll have another presentation talking about other types of punctuation, so be on the lookout for that. Thanks for your attention and have a wonderful day.